everyone, and welcome to the second Incite of 2024. My name is Candy Tanak, and I'm the Community Events Specialist here at the Vancouver Public Library. I would like to thank the Writers' Fest for their continued partnership with us. They have all been a pleasure to work with. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. As a settler of Chinese and Japanese heritage, I give gratitude for the protection these lands have offered me, and my intention is to use my words and my actions in ways that bring me into better relations with the Indigenous peoples. But words are fine, but let's talk about what kind of actions we can take as well. On February 14th, the Women's Memorial March takes place in the downtown east side to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It happens every year, and if you've never been before, I encourage you to attend and support the event. The march starts at 12 p.m., and there are events happening in that area until 5 p.m. and later in the evening as well. February is also Black History Month, but let's just say that Black History Month should always be, an all-around year kind of thing. I believe that institutions should lead with Indigenous and Black priorities at the forefront, and VPL has some programming coming up that you can find out about on our website. Now, a few library keeping things before we get started. The emergency exit is just out the door and up the stairs and through the main entrance. We will lead everyone out there if we need to. The washrooms are just out the door as well and to the right. And you may have noticed that we also have a new water fountain in the Alice just over there where you can fill up your water bottles as well. Tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have Téa Mutonji and her champion, Kudakwashe Rutendo, for a special Canada Reads event. I know I'm cheering for this book to win this year. I'm now going to turn the event over to Leslie Hertig, the Artistic Director of the Vancouver Writers' Fest, to talk more about the festival and to introduce tonight's guests.
Thank you so much, Candy, and hi to everybody here in person in the Alice Mackay room, and also hello to everybody watching from home. We're so delighted you're here with us this evening. This, of course, is an event presented in partnership with the Vancouver Public Library, and also tonight, Canada Reads and Arsenal Pulp Press. What a pleasure to have you all here, and we are just delighted to be a part of the Canada Reads debates this year. It's the first time we've had the chance to host a Canada Reads event, and we couldn't be happier about it. So tonight, of course, we are welcoming author Téa Mutonji and her champion Kudakwashe Rutendo. And it is great thanks to Arsenal Pulp Press and to CBC for making their travel here possible. We also would like to take just a moment to thank our government funders this evening. At the Vancouver Writers' Fest, we simply couldn't put on our event programming and our festival in October without the help of the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Government, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. For those of you who are new to Incite, the Vancouver Writers' Fest and the VPL run this series just about every other Wednesday night between now and the beginning of June. We hope you will join us. Check our websites because we are constantly updating that. We can let you know that the next Incite event on the 21st of February is going to be with author Sheila Hetty in conversation with Molly Cross Blanchard. So we hope you'll sign up and join us for that event. In just a few moments, I'm going to be welcoming Téa and Kudakwashe to the stage. They're going to chat for about an hour before turning it over to you, both our audience at home and those of you here, to ask a few questions of your own. And then Téa will be signing copies of her book over here. And books are for sale thanks to Black Bond Book Warehouse tonight. They are over here. So pick up a copy or two or three or four for all of your friends in your book club and get those signed by Téa after the conversation. Speaking of Téa's book, I would like to share a message from her publisher, Arsenal Pulp Press, and their imprint, VS Books. VS Books, which is Vivek Shreya's imprint with Arsenal Pulp Press, is once again accepting submissions. VS Books was created in 2017 with a goal of mentoring and publishing emerging, unpublished BIPOC writers living in Canada. Since then, VS has had the privilege of publishing Téa's book, award-winning collection of short stories, Shut Up, You're Pretty, which of course you are all here tonight to hear more about. And also Cicely Bell Blaine's poetry book, Burning Sugar. You may know Cicely Bell Blaine as a local poet. If you are an unpublished writer who is Indigenous, Black, or a person of color, and you are a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident living in Canada, you are invited to submit to this mentorship publishing opportunity. The deadline is September 3rd, 2024, and you can read more about the guidelines for this at vsbooks.ca. Now to introduce our guests for this evening. Téa Mutonji is an award-winning writer and poet based in Toronto. She has won the Journey Prize for her short stories, and Shut Up, You're Pretty was shortlisted for the Atwood Gibson's Writers' Trust Fiction Prize in 2019 and won the Edmund White Debut Fiction Award in 2020 and the Trillium Book Award in 2020. And now, of course, she is one of 5 shortlisted candidates for the Canada Reads Prize. Championing her book this evening, and also here from Toronto, is Kudakwashe Rutendo. She is an actor to watch who was first introduced to the performing arts through live poetry, and since then her passion for performance has only grown. Kudakwashe landed her first major role in the feature film Giving Hope, the Nicola Mitchell story. She's also a theater actor, featured in productions such as Lost Heroes of Oro. More recently, Kudakwashe was cast in her breakout role in the new feature film Backspot, directed by D.W. Watterson and produced by Elliot Page and Pageboy Productions. Kudakwashe stars opposite Devery Jacobs and Rachel Evan Wood in the film, which made its premiere at the 2023 Toronto International Film Festival. Please welcome Téa and Kudakwashe.
Hi, everyone. We're both so excited to be here. Yes, it's an exciting time. Okay, I'm really excited to be here in Vancouver. Thank you so much. So I wanted to share here a bit about Shut Up, You're Pretty. When I first read it, I was absolutely floored. The subject material, Téa's writing, she's just so gifted. And for those of you who don't know, Shut Up, You're Pretty follows 8 short stories that are interconnected following Loli, a Congolese immigrant to Toronto from the ages of 13 to 26. And during those years, we watched Loli undergo unspeakable things, but also partake in them as well. And there's a lot of growth in that. And what really stuck out to me was the writing that Téa used to communicate this entire story. It was gutting, but it was just also being seen. I think for a lot of women and a lot of people who are female presenting, a lot of the experiences in Shut Up, You're Pretty are just viscerally relatable. Things that we didn't know we wanted to put a word to until you read it and you're like, I've experienced that. I felt that. And when I was going in trying to find a book that I wanted to champion, I wanted to champion a book that spoke to me. I wanted to champion a book that I connected with. And that's what I found in Shut Up, You're Pretty. And that is why I'm so excited to be here with the book that I'm championing and Téa.
Thank you. It's actually quite exciting for me because we met and I realized through our conversations and just being in the same room together that Kudakwashe was actually one of the very first young Black artists that I got to sit down and talk to about my book. And that was a really precious experience for me that I started crying. It hasn't happened because, you get involved in the world, and then you sort of like kind of forget what made you want to do this, and then it's like, oh, you're why I do this. So it was really exciting for me, so thank you.
Of course. And I had an interesting discussion on the commotion with CBC, and I was asked about what the book brought to me. Was it windows or mirrors? And windows are this idea, like you reading something and you look through it, and then you see an experience that you're not intimately familiar with. And mirrors being the kind of book where you see your life or your experiences reflected back at you. Mm. And I was like, my answer for that was it's a bit of both. And I was like, I feel like the most wondrous books are a bit of both. So many instances I found instantly relatable to me and intimate to me, but also I found some others that I didn't have firsthand experience with, that I was just gaining insight and gleaning insight into in such a powerful way. And I was like, this is exactly the kind of book that you guys will be reading, and hopefully that you have read, and if you have not read, hopefully we'll be able to convince you to read it tonight. But yeah, so that's why I'm very excited to be here. And I'm going to start asking Téa some questions about the book just to help kick us off. And my first question for Téa is, Shut Up You're Pretty was originally published in 2019.
Yes.
How does it feel to have it being championed on Canada Reads now in 2024?
It's a very exciting experience in the very obvious way. It's like getting the chance to go back into something that is no longer the primary focus in your life. So on that experience, it's so cool to revisit something that I did at a different time in my life. But I always think that there's like the career aspect of it, in the sense that having access to the Canada Read audience and knowing that people who normally wouldn't pick up my book for whatever reason, to each their own kind of thing, are now sort of kind of interested. That is really, really powerful. And it also makes me feel like maybe I can actually keep writing stuff. So that's like the career
You can.
side of it. But,
You
know,
should.
I do have a bit of imposter syndrome, but on a personal level, it's I'm no longer the writer that wrote this book. You know, I started writing this book when I was 22, and I'm 29 now. So it's been my entire 20s. This is sort of like the work of my 20s, and to get to re-experience it as I'm moving on with my life has been a big privilege. And it's been like, oh, this is the person I used to be, and then yet I am still exactly that same girl who wrote this book. So it's been a bit of both. It's been really cool.
Yeah, and something I really connect with what Téa said is there's something very fantastical about being able to be here with a Canada Reads audience, because at the end of the day, everyone here is someone who loves books, and it's so refreshing to be able to talk about what we love with people who also love what we love, and who intimately get the joys we get out of reading books and the joys we get out of literature. So there's that really great connective aspect that Canada Reads has, and I think we're both very happy to be here among you guys.
Yeah.
And then question 2 is, Téa is actually going to read an excerpt from the book for us, I believe from Tits for Six.
Yes.
And yeah, you can take it away.
Tits for Six. It's the opening story of the collection, but it's probably one of the last ones I wrote. And I actually wrote it while I was on the bus going to school. And I don't know why, but I just sort of like pulled out my notebook, and suddenly I wrote this entire story. I feel like there was a part of me that felt that I didn't have a story that introduced my characters in the way that I wanted you to remember them. And I was still trying to figure out how to write that opening story. And then I was just imagining Jolie screaming, "Give me cigarettes," and then I wrote the story on my way to class in one sitting. It was a beautiful experience. It's never happened to me again. Okay, Tits for Six. Also, shout out to my editor, Shara Rose, who was very good at helping me like navigate titles. So this was like a team effort coming up with this title. Tits for Six. Jolie was my first friend. Her name was actually Jolietta. I shortened it to Jolie upon meeting her. I felt it captured her spirit more, her essence. The name came from a song Mother used to sing when we lived in Congo, where it was hot and mosquitoes didn't sting because we coexisted with them. Bébé de maman, jolie, 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 the song went. Mother stopped singing once we immigrated. She stopped doing many things, but I liked that she had given me this song, so I could now give it to someone else. And Jolie was in fact Jolie, long blonde hair, defined nose, blue in her eyes, roses in each cheeks, tall but not defiantly so. She was the one who introduced me to the park. She was responsible for my popularity and my likability because she herself was popular and well-liked, and I gained her reputation by proximity. But still, I was the girl next door. Unlike Jolie, I had perfectly ashy elbows and naturally posed, and this was my advantage on Galloway. People could relate to that. As for Jolie, she was simply unattainable. To want a person like her was to want too much from life. To have a person like her was to have everything and perhaps too soon. When we arrived, Jolie was sitting on the doorstep as though to check that the newcomers weren't freaks. And then she gave a thumbs up to a bunch of kids watching from the other side of the roundabout. There was another set of low-rise townhomes, peeling and browned, identical to ours. The thumbs up meant that we were acceptable, that we had passed some unknown street creds, and Jolie was both curator of said test. She introduced herself as we were unloading the suitcase from the taxi. That's all we had, suitcases. We were lucky enough that the previous tenants had left behind some furniture and that whoever ran the complex took pity on our poverty and allowed us to claim it as our own. "Welcome to Galloway," Jolie said, reaching her hand to greet my father. As they shook hands, she grimaced and smiled at him, stuck her tongue out, and winked. "Can he come out and play?" she asked. We all looked at Junior. "Not him," Jolie said. "The other one." "Loli?" my father said. And that's when we all realized she was referring to me. "Is she a girl or a boy?" Jolie tilted her head. My English was still so-so, but this much I understood. It had become a frequent question, though my hair had grown significantly since we landed. Before we left, I was given a buzz cut to match the picture of the boy in the passport I used to come here. Nobody thought that it would work. I looked too feminine, too soft. Soft nose, soft eyes, soft mouth, soft ears, soft cheeks. But by the time we got to the security gates at the airport, the soldiers were distracted and no one questioned me. But for a week after we arrived in Canada, I copied the way my brother walked, the way he ate, yawned, and brushed his teeth. Nobody told me that it was safe to stop pretending, and I found that I enjoyed this very much. I seemed to be more liked, more respected, but it might have been that the people who knew what we had to do as refugees pitied me, so they showered me with gifts and compliments as though any of those things could confirm someone's sex. But I wasn't confused. I knew who I was. I just found Junior's jeans to be more comfortable, and his shoes made more sense. So I never quite stopped dressing like him. I played video games, and for as long as I could, I kept my hair short. Maybe it was her age, maybe it was the season, but Jolie was the only person who actually confused me. She was also the only person who believed me when I said, "I'm not sad, not even a little bit." "Where are your parents?" my father asked. "Around," said Jolie. "Probably locked up in Unit 86. It's on the south side of the campus, in front of the park. If you want, you can come meet my mom." "You pray?" my father said. "To God, you mean?" Jolie said. Then she slapped her palms on the forehead. "Obviously." "Good," my father said. It was decided. Mother, my brother, and my father went inside to our unit, and I followed Jolie. On our walk to the park, she told me that the number one rule of the street was to tell men exactly what they wanted to hear. Usually, she told me. Sometimes, though, it turns them on to hear no. I followed Jolie silently, and we walked slowly. Every few units, a kid would be standing on their porch, which was actually just the part of the sidewalk that led to their unit. And they'd stare as we walked by. I got the impression of Jolie right there and then, a showstopper, a credible figure in the neighborhood, perhaps royalty. She talked and talked, mostly about the neighborhood, the boundaries and the places to avoid. She talked about her mother, Gigi, who was a nurse but currently unemployed. As she went on, all I could think about was that song. "Jolie," I said. "Do people ever call you Jolie?" So the name stuck, and I was proud to have been the one to give it to her. Jolie was wearing a jean skirt and a tank top that cut to reveal her midriff. She had fuchsia on her lips and her hair in a high ponytail. She was a strange mixture between a child and an angel, the kind you saw in religious textbooks, designed to inspire hope in you. But she also had this ragdog look that made her look like us, hard and used and tired. "Do you have cigarettes?" asked Jolie. We stopped at the intersection of Lawrence and Galloway. You got the best of Scarborough exactly here. The low-income houses attached to the getting-by houses, attached to the getting-there houses. But something felt so telling and obvious about this exact intersection. I had the sense that my life was changing, far more than I already had. Jolie had a very good walk. Later, I told my mom that when we were older, Jolie would be a model and I would be her personal assistant. My mom said, "You can be a model too if you wanted." But Jolie said, "Brains are allowed in the runway," before pushing them behind my ears. "We're going to need cigarettes," she announced, "or else I'll die." Thank you.
I really love that section. Do you want to talk about a little bit about it? Like, why this one?
So I was an undergrad when I was working on my collection and just when I was working on my craft in general. And Professor Andrew Westall had us do a character chart, which is where we write 10 things that your character would say and 10 things that they wouldn't say. And this was actually for nonfiction. So it was like your mom, your partner, whoever, what are things that they say and things that you know they would never say. But I did not want to keep I did not want to keep writing nonfiction, so I applied this to my fiction instead. And I had the line, I need cigarettes or else I'll die. And I just wrote that as an exercise. And then here I am on the subway or on the TTC thinking about this line, and I just knew that I had to put it in a story somehow. And I had most of the collection already written at that point. And so it just became very natural that I had to write a story that allows me to have Jolie say this line. I need cigarettes or else I'll die. And that's what came out of this exercise that I was thinking of on my way to school, knowing that I had not done my homework in like 2 weeks. So that was essentially what made the first draft of the story come together. But afterwards, when I realized that cigarettes could somehow be a metaphor for a lot of other things, it stopped being this like fun little story about wanting to, get cigarettes. It became this metaphor about wanting anything out of life, and specifically for these two girls at the time growing up in this environment, it was freedom. Cigarettes meant access to choice. It meant access to adulthood and respect or something. It was cool to smoke cigarettes, and this little thing became bigger than I intended it to initially.
Wow. And I think what's very interesting about this section is we see these young girls, and one of the first instances where they're able to get what they want is, in the end, is revealing their bodies to someone. And I think it's kind of there that they learn that our beauty, your body, can be currency as to how you navigate the world. You can get things that you want through being beautiful, through showing your body, which I find very interesting. And it kind of leads to the next question. There's many elements in this short story that I identified with, but foremost for me was just how you depicted womanhood. And that's what I alluded was very intimately familiar to people who identify as women, female presenting, and who navigate this world, but also Black womanhood. I remember the exact story where I was like, I'm going to champion this book, and it's The Boy from My Youth in the short story collection. And as I've alluded, as I'm sure many people know, navigating life as a woman is incredibly difficult. But I found growing up that navigating life as a Black woman was a little bit more nuanced and sometimes a little bit more fraught. I grew up in a small town, and I had heard my entire life, like, oh, I'm just not attracted to you because I'm not attracted to Black women, so much that you start to internalize that no one can be. For the majority of my life, I truly believed that I was not beautiful, that I could not be beautiful. And as a woman, that's an interesting thing to struggle with, because for a lot of our lives, we're kind of reduced to our beauty. That is our currency. It's unfortunate, but that's how we navigate a lot through the world is, are we beautiful? And people make decisions and they treat us differently, whether or not we bear any aesthetic value. And then as a Black woman, to not even be allowed to be beautiful was something that was very fraught for me, and something that I'd struggled with my entire life. And I'd never seen it represented anywhere. And then reading it, I remember when I read it, and then I finished the book that night, and then the next day I was trying to tell my friends about it, and I was like, I think this is the book I want to pick. But then I just started crying. And I was like, I don't know why. And then I was trying to tell them, and I was like, I never had the time to sit back and think. It sucked. Growing up and not thinking that you're beautiful in a world where you have to be beautiful sucks. It's horrible and it's painful. And I was like, I never let myself acknowledge that. And this was the first time that I had seen that in text, in literature. And I just felt so seen that I felt like I could finally put down all that I've carried, and this idea that and all the pain that I had, that I could not be beautiful. And, was reconciling that, it was a silly notion. But it's not as simple as that being like, oh, you're wrong, you are beautiful, because that's not really what a matter of it is. It's kind of undoing years and years and years of harm. But it was the first time that I was able to confront it, and that for me was everything. So this aspect of beauty and beauty being currency is a huge component of the book. It's a really essential theme. So what did you want to capture in these experiences when you were writing the book, especially about womanhood?
Yeah, it's really interesting because a question similar to that is a lot of people want to know how much of myself is in the book. And for me, I feel like the philosophic understanding of my life is sort of what I took and I replicated in a fictional lens. But that is, I had the exact same experience of growing up in different parts of Toronto, the GTA. I grew up in Scarborough, but I also grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, where my blackness actually not even my blackness, my entire identity as a external person was sort of like the first thing people wanted to see, acknowledge, and talk about whenever I walked into a room. So I knew that that was a motive that I had when I was working on this collection. And when I decided to give it to Loli, I wanted to push that even further and to really evaluate how a lot of young Black girls are growing up in a world where they are adultified very early on, and they're sort of told exactly what the rest of their lives will look like entirely based on the way that they look and nothing else. It doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how talented you are, it doesn't matter. All those things are just detailed. It's like, what do you look like? When you walk into a room, are you someone that is conventionally attractive? If yes, your life will look like this. Are you someone who is just sort of like not pretty enough? Then if so, your life will look like this. So that's something that I realized really early on was going to carry my story, specifically Loli's story. And then when I wanted to take that even further, and I started with like, they're gonna use their bodies and they're gonna use the way that they look and the way that they're presented in a stage and in a room in order to understand who they are as a person. It kind of went further than I expected, and I realized how currency was so attached to that. And it's just the language that was used in my childhood was a very big part of what I was doing here. And funny enough, I grew up as a child actor, clearly not successful because I'm now writing books. But I grew up, my entire life, how I looked was a very big part of my everyday study. You go to these acting classes, I was always the only Black girl there. And if there was another person of color, it was like, okay, well, Téa's cute enough to like get an audition. So with that language in mind, I think I always understood that the way you look has some kind of financial value, and I decided to play with that and then study that, and then also place it in Galloway, place it in this particular environment where financial realities is a big conversation, and see where that would take me. So even today, I still feel like these are two things that are really mutually exclusive, where how you look will have a bigger impact in who you are as a person. And I just knew that that was going to be the thing that carried the book entirely, because as a Black woman, that has actually been the entirety of my experience. It really doesn't matter who I am, it really matters what I look like. And that's like, I lived with that anchor on my shoulders, and there was no other way for me to explore that and for me to almost even like maybe heal from that than to write it into a character.
Along those lines, just to button this thought, one of my favorite stories in the short story collection is the title story, Shut Up, You're Pretty. And in this story, this exact theme is explored in wondrous detail, I think. It follows Loli, and Jonas is the person I'm going to reference, but he's her partner. He's not a very good partner, I'm sure many of you will discover as you read. But there's this very pivotal moment where it discusses exactly what we're talking about. They go to a restaurant, and then one of the servers' table has walked out on her, and then Loli is telling Jonas, like, oh, I think I want to help cover the bill. And he's like, oh, no, we have no responsibility to do that. And she's like, it could happen to anyone. And he says, no, it wouldn't happen to anyone. Specifically, it says, not to you, he said. Nobody would walk out on you. I mean, look at you. It's all about presentation. And there's this implicit idea in the story that really good things happen to pretty people. If you are a woman and you are beautiful, great things will happen to you. But if you're not aesthetically, if you have no aesthetic value, well, of course bad things are going to happen to you. Of course people are going to walk out on you. And of course then you deserve it. And just seeing that articulated, I was like, ugh. Because I feel like a lot of us, like we're navigating life and we're carrying this. And then just to see Téa just put it to words so wondrously, I was like, yes, that's exactly what I feel like a lot of us have carried. And it's nice to see it in literature and to be able to discuss it. Because I think that's one of the best things we get from books is the discussion we derive from them. And now we're able to have these discussions like now being like, a lot of how our experiences and how we navigate them oftentimes as women is based on our aesthetic value. And that is not right.
Yeah.
And this is how it's affected us, and this is how we've carried it. And I think that was amazing.
I feel, my background in undergrad, I was a media student, and a lot of the work is essentially we look at texts, movies, books, however you want it, and then we talk about it. We pull it apart and we try to figure out what's actually happening here. And naturally, a lot of the work that we were doing were predominantly from, it had predominantly white characters or white people in these texts. And so I was applying almost that skill of looking at something and critiquing it to real life. And by that I mean a lot of this book is actually research. So yes, of course, I use my own sensibility as a woman who grew up Black, but also I was also focusing a lot on what is the collective experience that seems to be echoing. And so it's like this aspect of beauty for me was really important to tackle because it actually is not limited to Black women. I hosted in this environment and this community, but I recognized that this was like a global experience that a lot of my friends were also having to navigate, and I grew up in a predominantly white environment, so naturally most of my close friends are white people, and yet we could still connect on certain things. And the major theme that me and my girlfriends growing up were really like, yeah, I see you, I'm with you, was how does the way you look affect the way you are treated? So it was really natural for me to want to tackle this topic specifically for this book. I'm a big research lover. I love like my favorite thing is if I watch a movie is to research every single person front facing that's involved, and then just like going a little bit like woo-hoo on it. And I felt really excited to get to do that. And I don't know if you talked about this, but I did grow up in Galloway, and I remember going back to Galloway while I was working on this book. And one thing that was really surprising to me is some people who I knew in my childhood were still there. And though I might not remember their names, I remember the experience I had with them. And it was really, really cool for me to sit down at Unit 86, which was my unit, and to just look out the world and see how little had changed from the 10 years since I lived there. And I feel like all that was a mission for me when I was working on this collection. And literature and fiction, it does a lot, right? You can have fiction that is meant to be fantastical and some kind of fever dream, and you could also have fiction that's meant to get really, really close to reality, and that's just sort of my personal, I guess, method of writing. I really like to get as close to the experience as possible, and so a lot of me working on this book was me researching things that I was really fascinated by.
Yeah, I think something that's very interesting is you mentioned you grew up in Galloway, and Galloway features pretty predominantly in the early parts of this book.
Yeah.
And as you read it, you get this very firm sense of community. Does that differ with some perceptions you've had of it, or that you've been combating with it?
I think that today I feel proud that I captured a Galloway that feels true to me. And the story I love to tell is, I was in Galloway up until the age of 13, and then I moved to Oshawa, Ontario, which is the suburbs, and that's what when I refer to a predominantly white environment, I'm talking about Oshawa. And I went back to Galloway, to Scarborough for my undergrad, and I was 19, 19. And I would tell people very proudly, yeah, I'm from Galloway, and there's a few slangs that we use, like G-Way or the Galloway boys that were really prominent in the media. And I was telling people about my childhood in a very excited way because I only had positive experiences. Mind you, I do recognize that I am a romantic, so I do have a way of romanticizing certain experiences, including all of my dates. I have a way of doing that. So I'm telling people very happily about my childhood growing up in this Disneyland, I would call it, because it did feel that way. We were children and we were free to go next door and just walk into the unit and say hello to whoever lived there. We were free, and we didn't have like phones at the time, right? Like we didn't have internet in that way. We a lot of my childhood memories is me sitting down at a park with my friends from the neighborhood and listening to Avril Lavigne and Fifi Dobson and writing stories or writing our own girl band, and it was really fun. It was creative. It was exciting. And when I would tell people as a young woman, Renew in Scarborough, that this is where I grew up and this was my experiences, all they knew was what they saw in the media. And immediately they would be like, girl, you are Delulu. That's not real. Like, that Galloway that you're talking about isn't what we saw with that shooting or like that barbecue or that whatever. And that was a big point of frustration for me because I felt like my own experiences was being taken away from me and also challenged and erased. So I really wanted to show both of that at the same time. You know, with the story, This Is Only Temporary, I am using language that is real language. The news report that Lowly is depicting are actual factual news report that if you were to Google Galloway at a particular time, this is actually how people talked about it. And that was really important for me to put that and just oppose it with the reality of this is a place of community care. This is a place where my mother knew that if she wasn't going to make it home tonight because she has XYZ jobs, then she can say to the neighbor, can you make sure my kids are okay, or can my kids come stay with yours? And that is beautiful. And I felt really frustrated that people didn't think that that was possible in an environment like this. So Galloway became a very natural place for me to place the story, especially considering the fact that Lowly's entire experience with life is that she's constantly being told who she is and how she matters. And I felt like Galloway has that same unfortunate truth that the world has decided what it means to grow up in government housing and what it looks like to grow up in Scarborough. And I wanted to take both of these truths and pin it against each other in a way where they could feel connected. And I'm hoping that I did a little bit okay. I mean, I'm on Canada Read, so maybe.
You did fantastic. I was awed by the sense of community. That's really what I took away. And I think that's a wondrous thing to leave any area with. It's the sense of community and connection that is very taught between people. So I really like that.
Thank you.
Segueing into our next question, one of the other things I was floored by in this book was the relationships that Lowly had with other women in her life.
Yeah.
There's a lot of intimacy in this book, and several different examples, some of it healthy, some of it unhealthy. But I found that some of the most potent intimacy was the ones that she had with women, such as Olivia and, so many others. So how were you going into writing this, and what effect do you think female friendships have for women, and how important are they?
I'm actually going to start by maybe quoting, not to a T because I don't remember the exact quote, but mentioning Lena Dunham in one episode of HBO Girls. She says that the biggest romance you'll ever have is the experience with your college best friend, your female college best friend. And I remember when I heard that in my 20s, I thought, this is true. I will never be able to love a romantic partner with the same intensity that I will love my best friend, who I call to ask questions about what's happening inside of my mind and outside of my body. These are not questions that at least I was taught to have with intimate partners, especially when it's in a heterosexual relationship. But there are questions that were so embedded in my relationship with girls. The weirdest thing happens to girls or people, we get periods, it's wild, and then it happens when you're like 10 for some of us, and it's really uncomfortable and really scary, and we don't always know what is happening, but you will turn to another girl and you'll be like, I'm bleeding, what does this mean? And I thought about that. I thought about the closeness that happens very naturally in these kind of relationships, and I became almost obsessed with it and to developing it. And on a personal level, my entire life has been held in the hands of the women that I've surrounded myself with, who have uplifted me and given me care at different stages in my life. So I made a lot of sense that this would also be the trajectory that Lowly was on. And I'm always thinking of, when I'm picking a topic to write about, it needs to fit what's already there. And since perception was already such a big part of Lowly's story, it was like, well, what do you do when you're being perceived constantly? You turn to someone who might understand that experience, and oftentimes that person looks like you. So this became a very natural thing, that the angels in Lowly's life would be the woman who she surrounds herself with. And I had the title, the ending story, Tilapia Fish. That was a poem that I was working on, thinking of my own mother, and I loved the energy that I was getting from working on this piece. So when I started developing this collection of stories, I needed to fit this poem in this collection somehow. And then it became very obvious to me that it would be the final collection, and that I was walking towards that, right? Like Lowly's story, I had to end there. And the question became, how do I get there? And I watch a lot of TV, a lot of movies, and the hero journey, every hero has a mentor. And I thought, how great would it be if she didn't have one mentor, but she had like a plethora of mentors, like a bunch of mentors along the way at different stages that had different purposes to arrive at this kitchen scene with her mother in the final story. So I became obsessed with finding a perfect match per story, right? When she starts, in the ending part of the book, I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, you meet Patty, and Patty is someone that looks like her, that's familiar because they're both from Africa and they're living in this tight corner and they're experiencing life together. And Patty is sort of like the beginning of peace for Lowly. And then just before that, you have Olivia, who is a bit eccentric and exciting and also very confident in her weirdness, which I thought was so fun to explore that. And, I have a lot of friends who are artists, bunch of weird people. And I knew that I kind of had to have that in the story at some point. And as I keep layering it down for each story, I knew that a story for me wasn't complete unless I had a mentor in it. And the mentor had to remind Lowly of who she is or who she could be. And so it became very natural for me to fit all these qualities together.
No, and Téa did a fantastic job.
Thank
Obviously,
you.
that's why I'm here. I really did love the relationship between Patty and Lowly. The scene in "Shut Up, You're Pretty," the title story that I keep referencing. Amongst the turmoil that is Jonas, there's Patty, who is constantly almost a lighthouse, guiding Lowly through her emotions, being there. I remember there's this scene between Patty and Lowly where Lowly is just going through it, and she calls Patty, who's out at a party, and she's like, and then Patty's like, "Oh, are you okay?" And she's like, yeah, I'm fine. And then she goes, "I'm coming home." And I was like, those kind of relationships, and without hesitation, Patty leaves where she is to go comfort Lowly. And I was like, there's something so magical in having those kind of friendships and in having those kind of relationships with other women where you have someone who is constantly there for you, who will constantly support you. And it was wondrous to see on page. I was like, I love it. I'm rooting for it. It's exactly the thing I want to see. And segueing into our next question, there's a huge theme of the relationships between mothers and their daughters, especially in tilapia fish. In what ways would you say that mothers shape their daughters?
Wow, that is
Just
a
an easy
big
question for you. I'll throw it at you.
I think in every way, possibly. I think that there's some themes that I became obsessed with while working on this story that are universal, but at the same time are extremely tricky. Something that I'm very cognitive of is the idea of the nuclear family and how it doesn't always apply to families that come from people who are in marginalized circles. And I mean that in a very broad sense. I'm not limiting to like Black womanhood, but I think of like so many queer people who aren't able to go to their parents, to their families, to their mothers and say, here's who I am. And so I was really curious as to what this would look like in a very bizarre, almost unspoken way, which I feel like is sort of what's happening between Lowly and her mother. Because there's a story of a girl who, I don't want to say loses her way, but definitely steps away from the household expectation. And then there's a story of the mother who lets her, who decides that the only way she can be a good mom is to let her daughter be a person, her own identity, and to hope that her daughter will come home. And that was their reunion story. Lowly does go home, but that, in the story with 10 years reunion with Lowly's father passing, and I was really experimenting with Lowly's mother. I feel, for me at least, that's her story more than it is the father's story. You see how this mother who has gone through war, the genocide, who has gone through immigration, who has gone through raising children, who has gone through having to start her life over as a woman in her 30s/40s, going through all of that, then experiencing the death of a loved one, and then also has to be a mom at the same time. That is a lot to put on one person. And I was thinking of how can I have all these things be true without having to focus on the details of that truth. And so I made her this almost stoic but welcoming, but I'm gonna go through life as life comes character. And I really thought that this was the only way for Lowly to have space to essentially go through all the stuff that she goes through, is if her mom gave her permission to do that. And I know that at least that was in some ways, maybe now that I'm older, that's probably a little bit how my experience with my mom is. Granted, my mom is a very religious, very hands-on person, and one of the first things she said when she read my parts of my book and also saw that a lot of people thought that it was about me, she said, "I wouldn't let you do that." Which was really, she was insulted. She was like, "People think that I would let you leave my house," which I think is fantastic. So it just speaks to how I was using a lot of the nuance of my relationship with my mom. She really did let me be a bit Téa in a lot of really bizarre ways, but yet she was also extremely hovering and in my face throughout my entire life. And so I was thinking about the way you just position the relationship between mom and daughter, but at the same time, the reality is both these people, despite their titles, are still individual people. And how do I allow that to be present on paper? And maybe I was cheating, but a very big way to do that is to separate them, right? To give Loli a place to be without her mom, knowing that mom is somewhere waiting, cooking fish,
Wow. I'm going to segue into a question that I really like. So sex and sex identity are huge parts of the book. Loli and other characters explore their sexuality in many different ways for many different reasons. And you write about these themes emotionally, intelligently, and with such grace. But writing about sex is not easy. Mm-hmm. So what approach did you take when writing about sexuality?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that was actually the most challenging part for me, mainly because it's really important to distinguish sex from what is not sex, but might be confusing from certain people who might not have access to language or education in a certain way. So that's like a really big thing that I still feel like when talking about the sexuality in the book, I'm also very careful because I recognize that the book does also deal with assault, which is not the same thing. So I just felt like I had to preface that.
Yes.
To answer your question, I think that I am very aware as someone who grew up reading, surrounded by literature and by the media, of the conversation that are happening about certain things and places and people. And I found it super interesting that historically speaking, and especially publicly speaking, Black women are hyperly sexualized, except that, and at the same time, the idea that Black women can be free sexual agents doesn't seem to track in a public way. Today, I feel like it's a little bit different with the advancement that we've had since I wrote the book, but these are things that I was really, really thinking about, especially having grown up a young Black girl. The over-sexualization of my person didn't seem to make sense to me, with also the fact that in a religious tribal home, I'm Maluba, I come from a tribal country or a tribal nation. The concept of me being someone who could have sex was like not a thing where I'm from. It's like you're not allowed to have sex unless it's to have children, is sort of like a lot of the language that's happening in a lot of, at least in my home country, but then it makes absolutely no, it's like super disconnected to the way that Black women are perceived in the media, and that was really interesting to me, and I wanted to play with both of those things. And so I guess I sort of became a bit, maybe, what's the word for it, like extreme with my approach to that. But ultimately, I wanted to have someone that was a sexually free agent while still aware of the way the world would take that freedom away from her. And that's, I think, what I was playing with, especially with Men, Tricks, and Money, where she decides to take her sexuality to the next level and take her pleasures to a way that feels beneficial to her in a world that is sort of like prepared to boxed her into one concept of sex. So I was really playing with a lot of ideas, and sometimes I, especially even now when I talk about it, I worry that I didn't do it like the way that it makes sense in my head, because ultimately I was someone that was so aware of the cultural language about Black bodies while I was working on this book, and I continue to come from that perspective. And I think that sometimes I became very maybe narrow-minded, like I was very much like, I'm reacting to this. And if you're not familiar with that, you might not be able to maybe catch what I'm trying to do, which is perfectly fine, but it's something that I personally struggled with, like how do I do it in a way that's accessible or that could be understood? And I had to, very early on while working on this book, I had to give up the desire to write something that everyone could understand and that everyone could appreciate. And I had to be very clear on who I was writing for or why I was writing this. And for me, I am reacting to the world that I live in writing this story. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I grew up in this body, in this world, without having access to that kind of literature. So that was like, when that became my ultimate goal, every decision I made for my character became simple. It was just like, I'm just gonna write what feels true. And I felt so, till this day, I'm so confused that the Black woman body is so hyperly sexualized, but then the Black women in our private circles are often not allowed to have sexual expression. That felt to me very, it's still a very big puzzle, and I really wanted to put that on paper.
That's really good. Rapid fire before we go to, I believe, audience questions. I just wanted to ask you, the theme for this year's Canada Reads is one book to carry us forward. How do you think Shut Up Your Pretty falls into that?
I mean, you you have this little child who grows up to be a little woman, I guess, and she really decides to take on life at the forefront of all the things that are imposed to her and to still kind of come out for air, which is the feeling I wanted to have while you were reading the story, because I think in a really bizarre way, that is actually my understanding of my life as a Black woman. There's a part of it that felt in childhood so suffocating, and so like I needed space to breathe, and I felt that I was sort of wanting to replicate that feeling of like, there needs to be a light at the other end of the tunnel. And for me, lightness came from the female characters, her friendships. It came from the fact that she knew she could always go home. It came from the fact that she knew that she had a place called home, that she had access to Galloway and to Mrs. Broomfield. So for me, I think that this book follows, I guess, the theme, because I mean, that was actually my interest. I was working on a story about a girl who figured out how to survive and how to captivate joy and peace and friendship and identity and power despite the life that is imposed onto her. And that word is really important to me because I wrote a story about a girl who is trying to fight through what the world is telling her that she is. And then in the end, I hope that that's, you know, I think a lot about that scene in the kitchen, the tilapia fish story when she arrives home with her mother. And that story to me is about, it was really about mom, right? Mom who has had this big life that we don't really touch on the book. And yet here she is in this beautiful Sunday day. And all she can really do is like, I'm gonna make lunch, dinner for my daughter who has come home to say hello. And that has to be enough. And I was really like, I felt really empowered by this access, by this, I guess, like this possibility that no matter what happens to you, you could always return home. And then once you do, it's very likely that there's gonna be a nice cooked meal for you and it's gonna all be okay. So on a book side, I feel like that is what I was working with. But on a personal side, I don't know, my book comes from answering an open call, right? Like Vivek Shreya wanted to work with a young, well, not young, I guess, but with a writer, a BIPOC writer in a world where that might not be that accessible. Like if it wasn't for Vivek, I don't know that I would have gone into publishing because at the time it felt like such an impossible thing to desire because I just wasn't surrounded by Black literature in the way that interests me. So, Vivek came into my life. I entered the open call, and now I'm living into a world that I could have never even give myself permission to dream about. So on a personal level, I fit the theme because I'm just like, Vivek came and then I got to work with Arsenal and I got to do all this and here I am 10 years later, or 10, well, here I am 5 years later. But on a book side, I think that I really was trying to tell the story of someone who, despite the world, said, well, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna be okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna add in for how I think that the book fits the theme, a little precursor to March 4th to 7th. But what I found very powerful is this is a compilation of interconnected stories. And you see as you continue to read how each story feeds into the other. You see how her past affects how she negotiates her present. And I think that's true for all of us. We are all carrying things. And as I alluded to before, when I read this book, I didn't even know what I was carrying at all. But when you give yourself that moment, you walk forward so much lighter. Once you confront and negotiate your past, there is such a freeing ability to negotiate your present and every moment that lies before you. And that to me is power. That to me is one book to carry us forward. And especially, as Téa said, in the ultimate story, Tilapia Fish, we see Loli going back home, going back into the past, and being able to move forward because of it. And in the book, there's this mantra that her mom says to keep her going. Téa's heard me talk about this because I think there's just so much power in it. Her mom used to say to herself when she first came to Canada, and English was a language she was still negotiating. She would repeat words from an infomercial, and Téa chose the words, "Here we buy," and that recontextualize itself as a motif to keep going in an unfamiliar world, in a place where you don't know where you belong, in a place where you feel uncomfortable, to keep going, to keep pushing forward. Here we buy, until you keep going to where you're at. And I think that those last three words of the book encapsulate so wondrously why we need to keep going forward and how this book will help us go forward, because our past is the biggest key to everything we do going forward. It doesn't inform us, it doesn't necessarily control who we are, but you need to negotiate it. I think there's a very big importance of negotiating where we're coming from and who we are in order to feed into who we can be in the future. And I think we're gonna do audience questions. I'm unsure. Yes. Okay. Oh wow, I have all the power. Does anyone have any questions for Téa or I? Yeah. Yeah, definitely The Boy from My Youth, because that's the first chapter where, like I said, it was the one where I was like, this is 100% why I'm going to pick this book. The boy that she's with, Dylan, tells her when he's breaking up with her, she's like, what's wrong? Like, what did I do? And at this point, she's made it clear she's done everything from him. She cooked for him. She cleaned the house for him. Everything he wanted, she did. And he's like, it's just not working out. And she says, why? Why isn't it working out? And then after probing him, he just says to her, after they've been together and after she almost, in a sense, devoted herself to him, he says, oh, I just never pictured myself with a Black woman. And just that moment, I had witnessed firsthand so many times in my life where I'm interested in someone, they're like, oh, sorry, I'm just not into Black women, or no, I could never be with a Black woman, or nuances of it, like, oh, sorry, I'm not into dark skins, and like your entire experience as a person is just reduced to that, and it becomes the mode that people reject you on base of your race. Mm-hmm. And like I said, seeing that in literature, it's pretty mollifying. It was everything that I needed to see in the moment, the representation that I craved, and to be able to have it in that way, and in a way that was painful and horrible, because after he admits all this, he goes on to basically make her console him for wanting to break up with him. And I was like, it's so funny, but I was like, it's also a very good kind of take on life. Oftentimes people hurt us, and then we're supposed to be the ones to be like, no, it's okay. You can keep going, even though you're the one who's taken the hurt and you've absorbed the blow. And I was like, that in itself was a greater message on something, but also like intrinsically, I was like, that is where I was like, I see myself. Thank you. Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it hadn't been something I'd seen before in literature. This was definitely the first time that I'd seen it. And yeah, like it was definitely also this was the baggage that I was able to drop. I was like, I hadn't felt beautiful my entire life. And I was like, it's also still something that I struggle with, which is unfortunate, but it's true. And I was like, being able to see it in a book and being able to see the representation, I was at least able, for the first time, to feel like I had permission to mourn and to feel sad and to be able to overcome it. Yeah. Any other questions for Téa or I? That might mean we did a great job. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Téa, we are rooting for you, and Kudakwashe, we're rooting for you too. Can't wait to tune in to Canada Reads in March to hear how all of this turns out. And we're so grateful to you for showing up here tonight and for joining us. Thank you all for being here. The books are for sale over here. Téa will be signing over here. Make sure you pick up a copy. Come and say hello. And thank you.
Thank you for coming.